Grace, mercy, and peace to you from God our Father and our Lord Jesus the Christ. A number of books have been written at various times in history which never made it into the Bible. We call them apocryphal books because somebody questioned their authority, but that doesn't mean that we cannot learn from them in some ways. And one of those books is the Acts of St. Peter. And that book was written centuries and centuries ago, and there's a story in the Acts of St. Peter, which I think will help us to grapple with the text that is the gospel text for today. And that story concerns a time of Jesus, when Jesus had been resurrected. And Peter was in Rome, and he ran away from those and denied Jesus once more. And outside of Rome, Peter runs into Jesus, and he says in Latin, "Quo vadis, Domino?" Well, I'll not try to impress you anymore by saying that again, but basically means is where are you going? Where are you going? Peter asks Jesus, where are you going? And Jesus says, I'm going back to Rome to be crucified again because my followers have not been faithful to me. I'm going back to Rome to be crucified again because my followers have not been faithful to me. And at that point, Peter realizes what he has done, and he returns to Rome, and he himself is in fact hanged. And legend has it that he was hanged upside down because he wanted to be hanged differently than his Lord. Now that particular story allowed a man by the name of Calvin Miller, who was a Baptist preacher in Nebraska, and then became a professor of preaching at various universities. He died recently, and he wrote a story in a poetic form, which was rather lengthy, and therefore I'm not quoting the entire poem. But he wrote a story, and the story was entitled, "My Quo Vadis Domine," my Christ has left my church. My Christ has left my church. And in the poem, he explores the question of whether Christ has indeed left the church high and dry. And in that particular poem, he goes through various scenarios in which someone, the writer in this case, meets Christ and discovers that Christ has gone or is going away. On one occasion, he meets Christ outside of a megachurch. You know what a megachurch is. There are thousands of people worshiping in a congregation, and Christ is sad. And when the man who wrote the poem meets Christ, he looks at him and he says, "Where are you going?" And Jesus says, "Somewhere else. I was in a megachurch, and there wasn't even a cross. I was in a megachurch, there wasn't even a cross." And then down further in the poem, the man again meets Christ, and he sees him outside of a dumpster in Jakarta. And he says, "What are you going? Where are you going? What are you doing?" And Jesus says, "I'm going somewhere else. But first, because no one has fed my people, I need to get some scrap of food from the dumpster so I can multiply it and make sure that my people, my hungry people, are fed." And then he again meets Christ, and this time outside another mega church. And he says to one of the individuals, Christ does, "Follow me." And the man who wrote the poem says, "I encountered Jesus outside of the church." And he again was sad, and the tears were running down his face. He said, "What happened? What is going on?" And Jesus said, "I'm sad because I invited someone to follow me, and they told me to mind my own business, that I have privacy rights, and I don't need to obey and listen to you, Jesus." So I asked him, "Where are you going?" And Jesus said, "Somewhere else." But then the writer continues, and when he gets to the end of the poem, he realizes that the question, "Has Jesus left my church?" is the wrong question. Because the real question that Jesus poses for everyone who is encountered in this poem, and everyone that you and I encounter, everyone here, and everyone that we see, the real question is whether we have left Jesus, not whether he has left us. And that's the question that I want to pose to you this Reformation Sunday. Has Jesus left the church, or has the church left Jesus? The Reformation itself clearly answers the question. For the people then, that's exactly what happened. Martin Luther, in so many words, said that the church had left Jesus, the church had left the gospel behind, the church was no longer being obedient to the original gospel, but it was actually establishing a church which had few characteristics, if any, with the first century, and mostly indulged people into thinking that they could be saved through what the church did rather than what Jesus did. You see, the Reformation is a way of telling us that Jesus has not left us, but that we have left him, and we ought to look carefully at that in our lives, not only as individuals, but as a congregation, to make certain that we are not participating in a congregation that has left Jesus. You know, it's easy to do. I don't know about you, but I find myself so often leaving Jesus and running down my own interests, my own concerns, my own desires. And I think we need to look at this text in order to counterbalance our natural tendency, which is not to surrender to Jesus, but to ask Jesus to help us with our desires and our concerns. Why is it important for us to look at this text? Because I think this text, which has traditionally been the text for Reformation Sunday, actually challenges us. It begins with the question, if we go to verse 24, which is the first verse, not that we read today, but the first verse that we need to look at. And here it says, Jesus said, I told you that you would die in your sins unless you believe that I am he who will die, you will die in your sins. You see the issue that I bungled up by reading it so carelessly. The point that Jesus is making is that life with him begins by believing him. The entire gospel, according to St. John, is a gospel of belief. It starts in the first chapter where John is talking about Jesus and is talking about the disciples, and they're talking about Jesus and the disciples as people who believe and therefore are children of God. And all the way through John, we find again and again the references that are made to belief. In fact, John, at the very end of his gospel, writes that I have written these things. Why? So that you will believe. Believe is an integral and extremely important part of our life with Christ and with one another. And we need to recognize that we must believe. But the interesting thing for me is that Jesus doesn't stop. He doesn't say, well, if you believe, everything is fine. You can now go along and live your life the way you want to live your life. Not at all. Jesus challenges you and he challenges me every step of the way with not just believing, but what does he say? Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, in other words, he's talking to believers, just as I am talking to believers. Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples. If you abide in my word, and we know from the 15th chapter of St. John that abide means to be grafted into him, to be so intimately involved with him that we are focused on him in a way that will allow us to recognize everything through his eyes rather than through our own. And so it isn't just believe. It is a belief that abides in him. And what does Jesus say? If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples. In other words, you're not just a disciple because you believe. You and I are disciples because we abide in his word. If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will then know the truth, and the truth will set you free. You see the progression? You start off with believe. And once we have the belief, we abide in him. And when we abide in him, we become disciples. And when we become disciples, then the truth will set us free. It's an apple and banana kind of truth. Jesus is our Lord and Savior. And if we abide in him and are his disciples, then you will be set free. And Jesus goes on, they answered him, but we're offspring of Abraham and have never been slaves to anyone. Have they forgotten history? Were they slaves to Egypt? Were they Egyptians? Were they slaves to the Assyrians? Weren't they slaves to the Romans, even as they were telling Jesus that they were free and had never been slaves to anyone? And you and I can have the same failure in our lives where we do not recognize how much slavery there is in our lives. When we do not recognize that Jesus indeed is the only one who can set us free. No one else can. And it isn't freedom in the political sense. It isn't freedom in education. It's freedom from sin that Jesus is talking about. And Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, for everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. You and I are slaves to sin. We can't help ourselves. It doesn't make any difference who we are. You and I are slaves to sin. You know, the only thing that is harder than telling the truth is to have somebody tell us the truth about ourselves. The only thing that, in my opinion, is harder than telling the truth is to hear somebody else tell us the truth about ourselves. And Jesus is saying to the Jews, I need to tell you the truth about yourselves. You think you're related to Abraham. You think that you're part of a great democracy. You think you're part of a great capitalistic system. You think that everything is going to be okay because you have an educational background that is surpassed by none. But let me tell you the truth about yourself. The truth is, we are all sinners, and only Jesus can set us free. Only Jesus can set us free. I wish I could tell you about a time just yesterday, no, Friday morning, when I was with a very good friend of mine who told me the truth about myself that I didn't want to hear, but I had to hear. I had to hear it because only Jesus can set us free. Buddhism isn't going to set us free. Islam isn't going to set us free. Hinduism isn't going to set us free. You can add all the isms that you want. None of them will set us free. Jesus is the only one who will. And the only one that you and I can go to in order to be set free. There's a story that I mentioned to some of you before about a man named Jim Elliot. Not the man who was involved and killed by the Indians in South America, but a man who was a park ranger. He got caught in a blizzard storm. And he was trying to find his way, and he didn't know where he was. And fortunately, he saw a cabin, and he walked and crawled up into the cabin, opened the door, didn't even close it, fell to the floor, and was lying there. And if it had not been for his St. Bernard, he would have been lying there for a long time and would have died. Fortunately, the St. Bernard came and licked his face long enough to awaken him. And he was then able to make a fire and survive. And what is interesting is what he said to the people who came and rescued him. He said, when I was lying there on that floor, freezing to death, I was in a state of euphoria. I was in a state of joy. I was in a state where nothing mattered. I felt great. Nobody needed to rescue me. And the issue for you and me is that you and I might feel great. You and I might feel wonderful about the way we are living our lives. But the question is whether we are fooling ourselves when in reality we need to have someone shock us back to reality and to life. And so here we are. Jesus has said, if you believe and abide in my word and follow me as a disciple, the truth will set you free. But the real truth that will set you free is called Jesus himself. In the 14th chapter of John, not too far after this, what does Jesus say? He doesn't say, I have a great philosophy. He says, I am the way. I am the life. I am the truth. He is the truth. And so today, when you leave this congregation, when you go outside, if you happen to run into Jesus, and you ask him the question, where are you going? What is he going to say? I'm going somewhere else because you have left me? Or is he going to say, I have some other things to do, but I'll be back because this congregation loves me